I stood in front of the fitting room mirror staring at a version of myself I barely recognized at 67. I had spent decades wearing practical slacks and loose blouse cloths made for comfort, not for compliments. But today was different today. I wore a navy blue dress with a delicate satin trim and a vintage brooch pin just below my collarbone. It costs more than I usually spend on clothes in 6 months. It suits you very well, Mrs. Prescott. The young saleswoman said warmly, adjusting a fold on my sleeve. The color brings out your eyes. I nodded quietly, unsure how to accept a compliment that felt so foreign. But I wanted to believe her. I needed to. In just 2 weeks, my only son, Colin, would be marrying his fiancée, Aubrey Monroe, despite the emotional distance that had grown between us over the years. I still wanted to look dignified, presentable like a mother should. I'll take it, I say, turning back toward the dressing stall change outside. The streets of Wilmington buzzed with early afternoon traffic. I stood at the window for a moment, holding the shopping. That close this town had been my entire life. I'd opened my first laundry here. I'd buried me husband here. I'd raised Colin here, and now this wedding, his wedding, felt like the last major chapter left for me in this place. Back in the parking lot, I climbed into me old Toyota and glanced at the time too. I had one more appointment before Thursday ended. At 3, I was scheduled to meet with the wedding agency, the same agency organizing a ceremony Colin and Aubrey believed was being paid for by somebody else. I started the engine and drove off in a worry that everything I believed about that day was about to change. The office of Evermore Weddings sat on the edge of Wilmington's business district, a sleek space filled with glossy white walls, floral samples, and framed photos of smiling couples. I was greeted by Tessa Raymond, a polite young woman in a cream blazer who looked barely older than my granddaughter. "Mrs. Prescott, welcome back," she said, ushering me into the consultation room. "We've prepared all the paperwork you requested." She laid several folders out across the table, detailed invoices, schedules, vendor contracts. "Are you still sure you want to remain anonymous in the billing records?" She said delicately. "Yes," I replied firmly. "Colin and Aubrey must not know. Let them continue thinking the Monroe family paid for everything." Tessa's expression flicked surprise, maybe confusion. Most families were eager to showcase their generosity. Few chose to hide it. "My son has complicated feelings about me," I explained, though I didn't owe her that. "He knew I paid for this wedding. He'd say I was trying to control things, or worse, that I was trying to buy my way back into his life. I didn't mention that after my husband died. 16 years ago, I had built a business from nothing while raising Colin, a loner that's somewhere between college and career. He had quietly decided I was no longer good enough for the image he wanted to project. When I sold my chain-off laundromats 5 years ago for a comfortable sum, his calls became more frequent, that only when money weighs involved everything will be confidential. "As agreed," Tessa reassured me. She passed over the itemized cost list: venue, catering, decor, photographer, musicians, more than $80. I scanned each line and signed with hesitation. Colin was my only child. Whatever had come between us, I still wanted his wedding to be perfect, and at that moment I truly believed it would be. Morning of the wedding arrived warm and bright. I woke before sunrise, took a long shower, and carefully styled Mistle's thick silver hair. I applied light makeup, something I hadn't bothered with in years, and slipped into the navy dress I had bought for the occasion. In a small white envelope I placed a check, a generous gift for the honeymoon. I sealed it with care and tucked it into my clutch, despite the weeks of planning and payments. I had never received a formal invitation, no embossed card, no rosy envelope, just silence. Still, I convinced myself it was anniversary. Surely no one forgets to invite their mother. I drove myself to the Belvedere Hotel, the most luxurious inn in town. The parking lot shimmered with polished SUVs and imported sedans. My old Toyota looked pitiful among them for a moment. I hesitated. Perhaps I should have taken a cab. Inside, the lobby was alive with laughter and clinking glasses, men in sharp suits, women in elegant dresses. I scanned the room for a familiar face, but found none. Grandma. A voice called out, and I turned to see Sophie, my granddaughter, radiant in Asaf blue bridesmaid dress, hurrying toward me. She wrapped her arms around me tightly. "I'm so glad you came," she said. "I was afraid you wouldn't because of everything." I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "I wouldn't miss your father's wedding, sweetheart, and I meant it. At least I did, then before." Sophie could introduce me to the others. I saw Colin approaching. He walked briskly, shoulders stiff, jaw tight at 42. He still carried himself like the Thester athlete he once was. Trim, composite ivory, gesture calculated, but his eyes, a shade darker than mine, were clouded with something I couldn't quite name. Panic, Mom? He said flatly, stopping in front of me. Not a smile, not a hug. Just, "What are you doing here?" I blinked, thrown off. "What do you mean?" "I came to your wedding." Colin glanced around as I worried someone might overhear. Then he gently took me by the elbow and steered me toward a quieter corner of the lobby. "Listen," he began in a low, controlled voice. "We talked about this." "No," interrupted. "We didn't. You barely called me twice in the past month." He exhaled, sharply frustrated. "You're not on Thega's list, Mom. We didn't plan for you, Toten. It felt like a slap. You didn't invite me." He rubbed the bridge of his nose. "It's complicated. This is a very curated event. Aubrey's parents, their colleagues. This whole thing has ascertained image." I stared at him. "You mean I didn't fit that image?" He avoided my eyes. "It's not about that, but it was, of course it was. You didn't want your guests to see your mother, the woman who raised you alone, low. Built a business from nothing while paid for this entire wedding because she's not part of your elite world." His jaw clenched. "Don't start." "I'm not starting anything, Colin," I said, voice steady. "I just showed up for my son." From behind us a voice chimed in, "Darling, is everything okay?" It was Aubrey. She glided toward us in a pearl-colored gown, every detail perfectly in place. Her tone was pleasant, her smile tight. Her eyes took me in like I was a misplaced chair. "Oh, Mrs. Prescott," she said coolly. "Such a shame you couldn't be at the ceremony. Perhaps another time." Colin didn't correct her, didn't protest. He simply said, "I'm sorry, but please go." And just like that, the moment broke. I nodded, straightened my shoulders, and whispered, "Congratulations to you both." Then I turned and walked out, my gift still sealed in my clutch, my heart suddenly heavier than it had ever been. I walked out of the Belvedere Hotel into the bright Wilmington sun, but the air felt cold. I made it to my car on autopilot, sat behind the wheel, and just stared at my own reflection in the rearview mirror. For a long moment, I didn't move. My hands rested on the steering wheel, still gloved in dignity, even though my heart was breaking wide open. They didn't want there, not even as a guest, not even his background. When I finally pulled out of the parking lot, I didn't head home right away. I drove aimlessly for a while throughout the old neighborhoods where I used to walk Colin to school, past the small strip mall where my first laundromat stood, that tiny storefront that had once been my pride, the beginning of everything I had built. By the time it parked in front of my house, my mind had already made a decision inside. I placed the gift envelope on the evening table, took a breath, and picked up me phone. I scrolled to Richard's number, me personal advisor at the bank, and yelled, "Mrs. Prescott." His cheerful voice answered, "How can I help you?" "I have a question," I said calmly. "If you wanted to cancel several payments scheduled for this evening, could that be done me?" There was a pause. "That depends what kind of payments?" I opened my mail and pulled up the wedding agency invoice, the Belvedere Hotel, Golden Elm Catering, Tessa Raymond Events, Rosebridge Florals. All scheduled for processing tonight. A substantial list. Richard replayed carefully, but most of those transactions are still pending. We can't freeze them. I want them all. Stop it immediately. I asked the reason. I was never invited to the event I paid for, I said simply, and I won't be paying for my own exclusion. There was another pause, then understood. He'll get the process started right away. One more thing, I added. I'd like to open a trust account for my granddaughter, Sophie Prescott. The funds that were immediate for the wedding I want them to go toward her education that can be arranged, he said while begging the paperwork this afternoon. As I hung up the phone, a strange calm settled over me. For the first time in a long time, I had done something for myself, not out of spite, but out of clarity. I would no longer fund my own erasure back at. Belvedere, the mood had shifted inside the grand ballroom with its towering crystal chandeliers and tables dressed in white linen. The early excitement had started to sour. The catering staff stood in clusters whispering with furrowed brows. The florists, still dressed in their branded polish, began removing arrangements from stage. Sophie stood near the terrace doors, nervously twisting the bracelet on her wrist. She watched her father, Colin, engaged in an increasingly heated conversation with the hotel manager, a portly man in a tailored gray suit. Aubrey hovered close by, visibly distressed, her makeup still flawless, but her composure quickly unraveling. There must be some kind of mistake, Cohen insisted. The payments were handled last week, confirm medium. Sorry, Mr. Prescott, the manager replied stiffly. We've just received word from our finance department. The main account has been frozen. Funds withdrawn. Aubrey's eyes widened. Frozen? What account? Sophie's heart thudded as she stepped closer, just enough to hear something told her she already knew the answer. Colin turned sharply to the manager. When it tightened the withdrawal. The sponsor off record, the manager replied, then glanced at his clipboard. Mrs. Lorraine Prescott. A stunned silence fell over the small group. That's impossible, Colin snapped. She didn't pay for this. It was Aubrey's family. A voice behind them cut in. Aubrey's father, Douglas Monroe. Excuse me, we only covered the rehearsal dinner. You said you had the rest handled. Colin Smith opened then closed. He looked at Aubrey, whose jaw had gone rigid. Across ballroom, guests began to murmur. Some checked their phones. Others looked toward the buffet tables, where servers were starting to remove covered tray. Sophie stepped outside onto the terrace. Dialed her grandmother. Grandma, she said when Lorraine answered. It's happening. The whole thing is falling apart. Lorraine's voice was steady. Fenty found out. You really canceled everything. I did, Lorraine sagently, and I don't regret it. Side the gals was escalating voices, rising. Aubrey pacing. Colin on his phone, a game face. Flushed. Sophie looked in through the glass, feeling a storm gathering and somehow relief beneath it. Maybe this was the only way truth would ever come to light. I woke to loud, angry pounding on my front door. It was just past 7 o'clock in the morning, and the sky was still streaked with pale gray. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, but the banging called me again, faster, harder, more urgent. Mom, open up. I know you're in there, Colin. I rose from bed, slowly pulled my robe around me, and made my way to the door with a strange sense of calm. I wasn't scared, not anymore. When I opened it, Hess stormed in without waiting for an invitation. His suit was rumpled, his tune down, his hair stuck up in wild directions. He looked like he hadn't slept a minute. You ruined my wedding, he spat, jabbing a finger at me. You humiliated me in front of everyone. I closed the door behind him and walked past to the kitchen. Good morning, Collinwood. You like some coffee? Don't do they? Snapped. Don't act like nothing happened. I remember exactly what happened, I said, calmly filling the kettle. You told me I wasn't welcome, so I made sure my money wasn't either. You planned this, he accused. You set it up to make me look bad. No, I replied, meeting his eyes. When I paid for that wedding 2 months ago, I had no idea Yao wouldn't invite me. What kind of mother would assume her own son would do such a thing? Opened his mouth, but no words came. Instead, he turned away, running a hand through his hair. You should have told me you were paying, he said finally. That's manipulative. Would you have accepted it if I had? I asked. That's not the point. It's exactly the point, Colin. You didn't want me there. Not as a mother, not as a benefactor, just invisible. He slammed his hand on the table. Fix it, call the bank, tell them it was a mistake, or store the payments. I sat down with my coffee. It's too late. The funds have been returned to my account, and most of it has already been moved. Moved where? To Sophie's education. I said simply, a trust fund for her future. His face froze. You Can't do that. I already did. And for once, I didn't flinch when he raised his voice. I had nothing left to lose and the very thing left to reclaim. Colin stared at me stunned. You gave Sophie the money? He asked it, his voice low but sharp, $80,000. 886. Actually, I corrected softly. The honeymoon was included. He blinked. You had that kind of money just sitting around. I sold the laundromat chain 5 years ago, I said, for $2.3 million. He sank slowly into a chair, his posture inflating. It was like watching a balloon collapse. You never told me. You never asked. I thought you were just living off your pension. I gave a dry smile. That's what you chose to believe. It was easier than facing the fact that your mother might have built something of her own. He ran a hand down his face. I can't believe this. You could have told me I didn't owe you an announcement, and let's be honest, Colin, you only came around when you wanted something, like when you asked me to invest in that tech startup your friend pitched. $200,000, no details, Noplin. That could have worked, or it could have disappeared. I prefer a safer investment. Like Sophie's future, he was skeet for a long time. Then, in a voice far too gentle to be genuine, he said, Look, I know I messed up. I shouldn't have excluded you. I was under pressure. Aubrey's family had expectations, but what can still fix this? I raised an eyebrow. Fix what exactly? What can redo the dinner? A second celebration? You'll be the guest of honor. We'll tell people it was all a misunderstanding, but he need that money. You have to wire it back. I took a long sip of coffee. No, Colin. That chapter is closed. His facet twisted again. You're punishing me. I'm protecting myself, and I'm finna accusing to give where love is returned. You'll regret this. He muttered, rising from the chair. No, I said, looking him straight in the eye. What I regret, I letting you treat me like a wallet instead of a mother. But that ends now. And in that moment, I knew there would be no fixing it. But for the first time, also knew I didn't need to. A week later, stood in the center of my now empty living room. The walls bare, the furniture sold or donated. The house that had held nearly 4 decades of memories, wasky, peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. I'd signed the sale papers that morning. The buyer offered above, asking Jigger to move in before summer. It felt like a sign I didn't cry. Instead, I packed my last suitcase and loaded it into the back of my car. My next destination, Savannah, Georgia. A smell-and-story home with a front porch and garden nestled in a quiet neighborhood not far from the coast. It wasn't just a change of scenery, it was a declaration I was done waiting around for calls that never came, for visits that only happened when money was involved. I was done shrinking myself to fit into the background of someone else's life. In Savannah, I would be nobody's mother, nobody's source of silent funding. Orsham, I would just be Lorraine. I'd already signed up for watercolor classes at the community center or something. I hadn't done since I was a girl. I joined a small book club too, and next month I planned to take my first cruise, something me late husband and I used to dream about, but never quite managed. I had that time, I had the means, and now finally I had the will. As I drove away from Wilmington, I didn't look back. Not because it hadn't mattered, but because of me life. My real life was finale beginning. 4 months later, I sat on the sun-drenched porch of my new home in Savannah, sipping iced tea and listening to the soft rustle of magnolia leaves in the breeze. I was no longer Lorraine Prescott, the forgotten mother behind someone else's success. I was simply Lorraine, retired content and finale-free. The trust for Sophie had gone athrow without a hitch. She'd college us last week, giddy with excitement after receiving the highest grade on her graduate design project. Thank you, Grandma, she said, for everything. I'd smiled, heartful. Supporting her had brought me more joy than any ceremony ever could. As for Colin, I hadn't heard from him, not directly. Sophie said he'd taken a smaller job and that things with Aubrey were strained. I wished him peace, but I no longer carried a silence like a wound. I had dinners with new friends, painted again for the first time in decades, and booked a Cascan cruise for the following spring. My suitcase was already half packed. For years, I'd lived quietly in the shadows of obligation and guilt. Now, in the golden light of a late afternoon in Savannah, I finally understood my second act wasn't about revenge, it was about release, and this time it was all mine.